At a kitchen table under a buzzing light, with a Bible page rough under your thumb, one mistranslated color can tilt the whole room. In Revelation chapter 6, the fourth rider is not called pale in the Greek text. The word is chloros, green, the color of wet grass after rain, of crushed stems on your palm, of living things. And once you hear that, you cannot unhear it, because you have been handed an image your whole life: four riders, doom, a sickly horse, a threat waiting somewhere ahead of you. But John did not write a colorless corpse horse. He wrote chloros, and that same writer uses the same word elsewhere for green growth. So why did generations of readers get trained to picture one thing when the page is pointing at another? That is not a tiny translation footnote. That is the first loose thread in the whole tapestry. Pull it, and more starts to come apart. The title of the book does too. Revelation. In Greek, apocalypsis. You were taught to hear that word and think collapse, fire, the end, the last scream of history. But that is a modern reflex. The older meaning is disclosure, uncovering, the veil coming off. And now the question changes shape. If the book is an unveiling, what is being uncovered? A future disaster? Or a structure you are already carrying around with you every day? Look at your own life before you answer too fast. Think about the moment your chest tightened, your face got hot, and you said something you regretted before the sound even died in the air. Think about the way your mind can split against itself. One part watching, one part reacting, one part counting the damage. You call that stress. You call it a bad day. Ancient writers had a different image for it. They called it riders. That is why they have survived every failed prediction thrown onto them. They were never durable because people guessed dates well. They were durable because they describe a pattern that keeps happening inside human beings. And if chloros, the green horse, was covered up in plain sight, what else was? In the next step, the text does something even stranger than changing a color. It stops looking like a forecast and starts looking like a map. If that kind of deep dive is your thing, subscribe and stay with me, because the next clue is hiding in the word apocalypse itself. That word, apocalypse, is where the next crack opens. You hear it and your mind jumps to smoke, sirens, buildings falling, the last page of the world. But the Greek does not hand you that picture. Apocalypsis comes from the sense of uncovering, of a covering being pulled back, of the veil coming off. That matters more than most sermons ever admit, because a book titled Unveiling is already telling you how to read its symbols. You do not unveil what is far away in time. You unveil what is close, hidden, misread, sitting in front of you while you call it something else. So ask the obvious question. If the writers are part of an unveiling, what is being exposed? You were taught to look out the window. John keeps pushing you inward. The moment you stop treating these figures like a headline and start treating them like a disclosure, the whole page changes temperature. White, red, black, chloros. Four forces, four movements, four disruptions that do not wait for history to end before they start galloping. You know them already. You have felt the clean rush of control, the heat of conflict, the dark, counting mind, the blankness that comes when your own perception lies to you. And now, the forensic part gets almost uncomfortably concrete. Walk into any classroom, any clinic, any old anatomy text with a faded diagram of the human head cut in profile. What do you see? The cortex divided into four major lobes. Frontal at the front, behind the forehead. parietal across the upper rear, temporal at the sides near the temples, occipital at the back where sight is processed. 4 lobes, 4 riders. Is that proof by itself? No. But it is a map. And it is the first map in this whole story that does not ask you to wait for someday. It asks you to notice what your own skull is already carrying. This is where people get nervous, because they think symbol and anatomy cannot touch. Why not? Religion has always named inner experience with images. Science names the same terrain with tissue, function, and circuitry. Different languages, same battlefield. Once you see that, the old fear story starts to lose its grip. The question stops being, when do they arrive? It becomes, which one is driving me right now? And that first rider, the one associated with command, turns out to have a real address in the brain. In the 19th century, one accident made that impossible to ignore. And after it happened, a man was still alive, still speaking, still walking, but the part of him that could hold the line had changed. That man was Phineas Gage, and his story matters here for one reason that is hard to shake once it gets into your head. A blasting accident in the 1840s sent an iron rod through the front part of his brain. He survived. He could stand, speak, recognize people, keep moving through the world. But the people around him said something vital had shifted. The old steadiness was gone. The filter was thinner. Judgment, restraint, social control, those had taken a hit. You do not need every dramatic retelling of the case to see the point. Damage the frontal region, and a person can remain present while losing the part that keeps impulses in line. Now hold that beside the first rider. The white one is usually preached as conquest in some distant prophetic scheme. Fine. But what if conquest begins much closer than that? What if the first victory is over your own reflexes, over the surge in your throat when anger rises, over the sentence forming on your tongue before your wiser mind can catch it? The rider on white starts to look less like a calendar event and more like executive control. The part of you that plans, inhibits, chooses, says yes here and no there. The part that has to win its authority again and again. So the old imagery becomes sharper when you put it against a brain map. 4 lobes, 4 riders is not a cute coincidence if one of those regions lines up with command itself. And once that command slips, the rest of the system does not sit quietly waiting. It moves. You know this already from experience, even if you never use the word frontal. You get cornered in an argument, your shoulders rise, your pulse jumps in your neck. A hot sentence comes out before your better judgment arrives. 10 minutes later, with the room silent and the air stale, you wonder, why did I do that? Who was steering just then? That question is the whole hinge of this reading. Because if the white rider corresponds to restraint, then the others are not random symbols either. They are pressures that flood in when that restraint weakens. One governs the body's sense of injury and threat. One keeps time, words, sequence, and mental bookkeeping. One constructs the visual world so convincingly that even error can feel true. And the next rider to move is the one you feel in your skin first. Red, immediate, physical. The horse that turns the body itself into a field of alarm. That red rider makes more sense the moment you stop imagining battlefields first and start paying attention to your own body. Think about how fast conflict becomes physical. Your jaw locks, your stomach drops, the back of your neck turns hot. A harmless sound in the next room suddenly feels sharp. Somebody's tone lands on your skin like grit. Before you have a full thought, your body has already marked the moment as threat. That is the territory this second horse seems to ride through. Sensation, impact, boundary, alarm. On a standard brain map, that territory belongs largely to the parietal lobe. It sits higher and farther back than the frontal region, and it helps build the body's running map of touch, pressure, position, heat, pain. In plain terms, it helps you know where you end and the world begins. That matters more than people think. Because once that map gets noisy, you do not just feel a hand on your shoulder or a cold floor under your feet. You can start to feel the world itself as intrusion. That old line about peace being taken away starts sounding very different when you hear it through that lens. You do not need armies to lose peace. You only need the body to remain on alert long after the actual danger has passed. Then, every room has an edge. Every conversation has a hidden blade. Every pause feels loaded. You have lived that, haven't you? The body buzzing even while the house is quiet. The refrigerator humming in the dark. The bedsheet rough against your calf. Nothing happening outside, and yet something inside has already mounted up. This is where the riders start behaving like a sequence instead of a set of isolated symbols. The white one slips and command weakens. The red one floods the field with sensation and strain. Suddenly, everything is closer, louder, harsher. You are no longer simply thinking about trouble, you are wearing it in your shoulders and carrying it in your breath. And once the body enters that state, another force moves in almost immediately. It starts counting. It measures tone, delay, fairness, loss. It keeps replaying who said what and when. So the next horse is darker. It does not come at you through heat, it comes through accounting. The strangest part is that even the name of the brain region waiting in the wings points in that direction, because its old Latin root carries two meanings at once, and both of them fit the rider too well to ignore. That Latin root is tempus, and it carries a double weight that fits the third rider almost too neatly. Tempus means time. It also gives you the temple, the side of the head where that lobe sits. So when you hear temporal lobe, you are already hearing the old word for time buried inside the anatomy. And once that clicks, the black horse stops looking vague. It starts looking precise. This rider is about sequence, measure, memory, words lined up in order, one thing after another, cost after cost after cost. You know the feeling. The room is quiet now. The argument is over. The red surge has cooled a little. But your mind will not let go. It replays the order of events like beads sliding on a wire. First they said this, then you answered that. Then came the pause. Then the look on their face. Then the text you did not send. Then the bill, the delay, the lost hour, the old wound reopened. That is Black Horse territory. It counts. It compares. It keeps a ledger even when you beg it to stop. The old image in Revelation is a rider carrying scales, and people often leave it there as some distant market symbol. But scales are not only for grain, they are for weighing, for pricing, for deciding what equals what. That is what your mind does when this system takes over. It turns life into units. It starts assigning value to every silence, every favor, every insult, every minute. You feel it in your temples too, don't you? That dull pressure behind the eyes when thought becomes bookkeeping. This is why the horsemen read differently once the veil starts lifting. They begin to form a chain. Restraint weakens. The body goes on alert. Then the measuring mind arrives and starts writing everything down in invisible ink. Time itself becomes a burden. You stop living inside a moment and start auditing it. And there is one more layer here. Language lives partly in this same neighborhood: meaning, naming, comprehension. So when this rider darkens the field, you do not only count pain, you narrate it. You tell yourself what it means, how long it has lasted, why it proves what you already fear. That is how a symbol becomes a prison. But the last rider is stranger than all of them, because he governs the part of you that makes a world appear at all. And when that one slips, you can lose contact with what is right in front of you, while still insisting you see clearly. That last step is where the whole reading turns from clever to disturbing. The occipital lobe sits at the back of the head, and its job is bound up with vision. When you open your eyes in the morning and the room appears, window light, chair in the corner, dust on the shelf, the line of the door frame, you feel as if sight is just arriving from outside. But the brain is doing far more work than that feeling admits. It is assembling, sorting, stabilizing, turning signals into a world solid enough for you to trust. So think about what the fourth rider means in that light. Chloros, the green horse, already broke the old picture by carrying the color of living grass. Now it becomes stranger. Green is tied to growth, to vitality, to the visual world of leaves, stems, moss, spring fields after rain. Yet this same rider bears the darkest name in the set. Why would death arrive wearing a color associated with life? Because the issue may not be decay first, it may be false world-making. A system meant to support life can also leave you trapped inside a convincing error. Neurology has seen versions of that. There are cases where damage to visual processing leaves a person unable to see properly, yet still certain nothing is wrong. They speak with confidence. They reach for things that are not where they think they are. They fill the gaps. That is the detail you should not brush past. The danger is not only blindness. The danger is blindness accompanied by certainty. You do not just lose the map. You go on insisting the map is fine, while walking straight into what is in front of you. Now read the riders as a chain again. The first loses command. The second floods the body with alarm. The third begins measuring and narrating everything. Then the fourth touches perception itself. At that point, you are no longer just upset or obsessed. You are inside a reality your own system is helping generate. That is why these figures have such staying power. They describe what it feels like when the mind fragments and still calls itself whole. And if you are hearing an old theological echo in that, you should. Because the ancient vision did not place these forces in random order. It arranged them as a release sequence, one after another, as though something sealed had to be opened before they could move. Which raises a harder question than color or anatomy. If the riders correspond to systems inside you, what breaks the seal between them? What lets separate regions stop cooperating so badly that each one starts behaving like its own authority? That break in cooperation has a name. And once you hear it, the old image of sealed riders starts sounding far less mystical and far more intimate. Neurologists call it disconnection. Not madness in the movie sense, not some theatrical collapse. A failure of regions to share information the way they should. The wiring is still there. The skull is still closed. The person is still standing in the room, pouring coffee, answering questions, checking the lock on the door. But inside, coordination can thin out. One system surges before another can steady it. One part knows, another reacts, a third starts telling a story about what just happened. That is how these figures begin to feel less like ornaments and more like functions. This is why the older brain studies matter. When surgeons in the 20th century separated communication pathways between hemispheres to reduce severe seizures, the results forced a brutal question into the open. How many yous are hiding inside what feels like one smooth self? Researchers like Roger Sperry showed that a mind can contain parallel processes with shockingly poor communication between them. The person still looks singular from the outside. Inside, the traffic is far messier. So when Revelation presents sequential releases, why assume monsters charging across the horizon? Why not ask whether the text is describing what happens when inner authority fragments and the parts stop reporting cleanly to one another? Norman Geschwind pushed that line further with what came to be called disconnection syndromes. His point cut deep. Some of the strangest human breakdowns are not caused by a region being destroyed. They happen when connections fail. Read that again, because it changes the whole spiritual argument. The problem is not always that one horse exists. The problem is that they stop riding in relation. The body alarms without counsel. The measuring mind keeps score without mercy. Vision goes on presenting a world it has partly misread. And the rider of restraint arrives late, breathing hard, trying to catch up. You have felt a softer version of this. The hand moves toward the phone before the wiser thought arrives. The text gets sent. The pulse is already up. The jaw is set. Then comes the explanation, neat and polished, as if the story were in charge all along. It was not. It was covering the gap. And that still leaves the sharpest question hanging in the air. If fragmentation can happen this easily, what does reintegration look like in a real human brain? Not in poetry, not in doctrine, but on a machine that can actually measure it. That measurement exists, and this is where the argument stops being a poetic game and starts touching instruments, electrodes, signal patterns, things you can record. In the early 2000s, Antoine Lutz and Richard Davidson studied long-term meditators and watched what happened when trained attention settled into a deep, open state. What showed up was not a tiny change in one corner of the head. It was broad gamma synchrony across the brain, different regions firing in unusual coordination at the same time over distance. If fragmentation is one part speaking over the others, this was closer to the opposite, a chorus instead of a shove, a system moving together. You should feel how explosive that is for this reading of the writers. Because if disconnection gives you the inner conditions for white losing command, red flooding the body, black starting its grim accounting, and chloros, the green horse, bending perception itself, then coordinated activity points in the other direction, toward reintegration, toward the kind of inner order ancient writers could only picture through crowns, thrones, seals, and opened heavens. The language is different. The structure is startlingly similar. And notice what the practice involves. Stillness, sustained attention, repeated return. You sit in a quiet room, and the first writer is not the first one you meet. Far from it. You meet the others almost immediately. The body complains. The skin itches. The shoulders tense. That is the red field. Then the counting starts. How long has it been? Am I doing this right? What is that sound? That is the black horse at work, measuring every second. Then images flicker in the dark behind your eyes. Scraps of memory, color, faces, drifting scenes. Vision keeps manufacturing content even with the room dim and your eyes closed. The green one is there too. So the discipline is not decorative. It is a confrontation. You are sitting down in one place and discovering that the riders were never very far from the chair. Now the pressure shifts again. If these systems can be observed and, under the right conditions, brought into better coordination, then the white rider's role has to be rethought one more time. Maybe command is not raw force. Maybe it is trained return. Maybe authority in the mind is not something you are given once. Maybe it has to be earned in the only place it counts, in the moment the others start pulling. And that brings us to the final piece of the puzzle, because the old text does something with the first writer later on that changes everything about how this story ends. That change in the first writer is easy to miss if you only remember the opening scene and never follow the image to where the book takes it later. At the start, the white horse carries authority in a fragile way. It feels active, contested, in motion. You can hear effort in it. That fits the inner reading almost too well, because restraint in you is often like that. It does not sit on a throne all day with folded hands. It works, it interrupts, it returns after distraction. It catches the hand halfway to the send button. It feels the heat in the chest and tries to cool the room before the red surge spreads. You know that kind of authority. It is real, but it is not effortless. By the end of Revelation, the image of the rider on white carries a very different weight. The figure is no longer introduced as one force among several breaking out in sequence. He appears in a position of settled mastery. The whole emotional charge changes. The scattered pressure of the earlier scene gives way to unified command. If you are reading the Horsemen as inner functions, that shift matters enormously. It means the text itself contains a movement from fragmentation toward order. The book does not only unveil the problem, it preserves the shape of the answer. And that answer is not passive belief. This is where people try to escape into slogans, and the text will not let them. If your own experience is any guide, the white rider does not gain ground because you admire self-control from a distance. He gains ground when attention stabilizes, when impulse is delayed, when the story in your head is no longer allowed to outrun the facts of the moment. In other words, when trained awareness shows up on time. So the science section and the scripture section lock together here instead of fighting. Broad synchrony in the brain is the measurable side of what sacred imagery presents as restored rule. The symbols and the circuitry are not enemies. They are describing the same recovery from different ends of the tunnel. So go back through the sequence one more time and feel its cost. The body on alert. The mind keeping ledgers. Vision convincing you that your distorted map is still trustworthy. How many choices in your life were made under that arrangement? How many broken conversations, broken promises, broken nights? This is why the old fear reading is too small. The stakes are not theatrical, they are painfully ordinary. And the final question is no longer what the writers mean. The final question is whether you can feel, in real time, the exact moment the frontal lobe retakes the reins. That moment is smaller than people expect. It is not thunder. It is not a trumpet in the clouds. It is the half second at the kitchen table when the message is already typed, your thumb is hovering over the screen, and something in you finally notices the heat in your face, the tightness in your chest, the old black ledger starting up again. You catch the picture your mind is painting. You catch the body bracing for a fight that is not in the room. You catch the story before it hardens. That is where the whole reading lands. The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse turn out to be terrible precisely because they are ordinary. They do not need mythic weather to move. They move in the everyday machinery of a divided mind. First command slips, then the body sounds the alarm. Then time, language, and grievance start measuring everything in sight. Then perception helps seal the whole thing shut, and you call the distortion truth because it arrived wearing your own voice. But the old text hid the answer inside the same symbolism. Once you stop reading it as spectacle, The sequence changes from threat to diagnosis. The unveiling was never a special effect. It was recognition. The sacred image and the brain map keep pointing at the same human fact. A person can be overtaken in layers, and a person can also recover in layers. So the mistranslated color mattered from the beginning. Chloros was the clue. The fourth rider carried the color of living grass because the final danger was rooted in life's own systems, in the green circuitry that helps a world appear. And the title was the second clue. Apocalypsis was never asking you to panic. It was asking you to uncover. So go back to that first scene under the humming light, the page under your fingers, the rough paper, the single word that had been dulled for you by habit and fear. You thought one horse had been faded into pallor. In a way, yes. But something else had been washed out more completely than the color. The nerve of the whole book had been bleached. Then the room gets quiet again. The phone screen goes dark in your palm. The refrigerator hum stays steady. Outside the window, the lawn is still there, green in the last of the evening light. And for one plain second, you can feel what the text was trying to hand back to you. The fourth horse was never pale. The veil was.